Tonight, Dr. Plague reads, The Dead Comes Due. Enjoy. My brother died last week. It happened very suddenly. He was on his way to work when a semi blew through a red light and smashed his car to pulp. He died at the scene. The police told me that it was unlikely he'd suffered in his final moments. They told me this like it was meant to bring me some kind of comfort. The officer seemed to think I might be in shock when I didn't immediately break down and just thanked him for letting me know and closed the door. They didn't know the kind of relationship my brother and I had, apparently. Very little would have brought me any comfort at the mention of my brother, Gary. That's why I was surprised when a man showed up the day after his funeral. He was a short man, looked about in his 50s, but at the same time he looked a lot older. Wasn't sure why at that moment, but he looked like a man who's wearing a costume he's grown way too comfortable in. He looked like an undertaker. Black suit, bowler hat, boots that looked so old they were ready to fall off his feet. When he smiled, his grin looked right out of a funhouse. He'd flashed that smile full of slanted gravestones at me before starting his business, and it had made me shudder. Miss Graham, I know this is a very troubling time for you, but I've come to speak with you about a matter of your brother's debt. I sighed. This isn't a great time, sir. If you could please come back another... Ma'am, if there were any way I could postpone this matter, I would. But the business at hand is of the utmost importance. Well, that's what I get, I suppose, for being my brother's last living relative. Gary had never been an easy sibling to have, and our relationship had been far from loving. We were never antagonistic, at least I wasn't anyway, but Gary always harbored a deep sense of resentment for something he felt I'd stolen from him. You see, Gary was born during a time when my parents were probably not doing so well. They had recently bought a house, my father had started a new job, my mother was finishing her degree, and a new baby was less than ideal. My mother dropped out of college to take care of Gary. My father became the sole breadwinner for the household, and this led to a lot of resentment between the two. My brother's first 8 years of life were filled with fights, separations, reconciliation, and a lot of turmoil. By the time he was 7, our parents had begun to get a handle on their debt, as well as their marriage. They began to repair their fragile marriage, and a year later, I was born. This isn't a great time, I reminded him as we sat down at the kitchen table. He just grinned those gravel-gray teeth at me and opened his briefcase. It rarely is, ma'am. Nevertheless, we must settle your brother's debt before he can truly pass on. I raised an eyebrow at the strange statement, but I listened as he ran through the particulars of my brother's debt. This fit the sort of relationship we'd had to a T. My brother, even in death, couldn't stop stirring shit up. We'd had very different childhoods. Money wasn't as tight when I was a kid, which meant our parents weren't constantly worried about debt. Mom had finished her degree somehow during those turmoil-fueled years and seemed to thrive in her new job. 2 incomes meant the financial burden that hung over their heads was finally beginning to ease back a little bit. Dad got a promotion at work and was suddenly working days instead of nights. He would be home at night to help with the kids and spend time with his family. Mom's new job provided daycare, so she could spend time with me during the day and still maintain a 9-to-5 job. This meant that both parents were home at night to help with projects and homework and generally spend time with the family. Of course, it wasn't all roses, but my birth seemed to help heal the damage to my parents' marriage. The only turmoil I remember was between them and Gary. Having a new sibling meant less time for him, so he did what all kids do when faced with less parental influence. He acted out at home, which got him punished and scolded, but not the attention he wanted. He acted out at school, and his already poor marks slipped lower and lower. It was decided that he would need to repeat the 3rd grade. He became a bully, to hear my parents tell it, and they had to transfer him to a different high school because he got himself expelled for fighting. When he failed the 10th grade at 17, he dropped out. That seemed to be the last straw between him and my father. Their fights got loud, going on at all hours of the night, and then Gary made them physical. Dad never hit him back. Dad was a shouter, but not a hitter. Gary, on the other hand, would get right in his face and taunt him to take a swing before pushing him away or slapping him. Then, one night, Dad just had enough. He told Gary to pack his things and get out. If you're old enough to drop out of school, you're old enough to make your own way, Dad said. And to his surprise, Gary left. I think my parents thought that some separation would show him how good he had it at home, but Gary actually seemed to thrive out on his own. He got a job. Eventually, he got his GED and found his own place in the world. His small success did little to curb his anger, or his attitude, though. He became an angry ghost that haunted our house sometimes, coming by to eat a meal or do some laundry. Only if Dad wasn't home, of course. My mother felt sorry for him, and Gary often came around to borrow money or complain about his job or the relationship he was in at the time. For us, however, his absence was far from a detriment. Miss Graham. I realized I'd been wool-gathering and snapped back to the present. I was saying that your brother's debt is the last bit of business on the books, and my superiors are eager to see it settled. I pursed my lips. This was highly improper. My brother was dead, barely in his grave, and this creep was talking about debt. I couldn't imagine what a guy like this would have to offer my brother. I couldn't imagine what this oddly dressed man would have to provide anyone. I doubted Gary could have afforded anything he could provide, for that matter. What exactly is the nature of your business, sir? So far, it sounds a little sketchy to me. He chuckled. Why, we make deals, Miss Graham. We fulfill desires. People desire things, as you surely know, and are willing to pay the price for them. Some want money, some want love. But your brother was very interested in the idea of comeuppance. He had several accounts he wished settled, most of them aimed at people he felt had wronged him. My blood ran cold. What the hell had Gary gotten himself into? My brother's career was, to say the least, vague, but I knew by the constant contact that it was both demeaning and didn't pay very well. Could Gary have gotten himself mixed up with bad people in exchange for some twisted sense of revenge? The man opened a file folder and began leafing through it like a man reliving memories in a photo album. It began when he was 16. His landlord kept increasing his rent. Rent that he held was already too high, and he approached us to represent him. After that, an instructor at his college he felt had it out for him. Then a boss who expected too much of him, a co-worker, a one-time companion. He glanced up at me, and I swore a smile played across his serpent's lips as he delivered the blow. Your mother? Our mom? I said surprisingly. Mom had died very suddenly. She started teaching after retirement and seemed to enjoy her classes in business and law. After class one day, I'd come to surprise her and found her in her office, slumped over her computer. I had thought she was asleep. Mom often slept poorly, when there were papers to grade and lessons to plan. But as I neared her still form, I was horrified to find her bleeding from the ears. I'd called the ambulance, but she was dead by the time they found her. I had hoped they might be able to do something, but the paramedics had just shaken their heads and loaded her onto a stretcher. They zipped her up into a black plastic bag they used to spare the living and wheeled her out to the ambulance. The doctor told me the same thing the police had told me about Gary's death. It was quick. She probably didn't even feel a thing, they said. She'd had a brain aneurysm at the age of 49. Gary hadn't come to the funeral, and that surprised me. Mom had always tried to referee between Dad and Gary. She'd even taken Gary's side a few times when he had made a good point or he'd been right. They'd fought the day before she died, though, a vicious phone argument where she told him that it was time to grow up and stop complaining all the time. If you hate your job and your life so much, then change it. I can't keep giving you money if you're not going to do anything responsible with it, she had told him. Without him, it had just been me to take care of my grieving father. Our mother had a brain aneurysm, you sick fuck. For you to even suggest that Gary had anything to do with this is ridiculous. Don't misunderstand, Miss Graham. Your brother merely called in for mediation. I was the one who did all the work. It was, as it happened, some of my best work. He said it with an almost wistful tone. I think you better leave, I told him hotly. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but it's not. Then, of course, there was the business with your father. I stopped, unable to speak. What could I say in the face of this pronouncement? The man was... what exactly? Claiming to have killed my mother with a brain aneurysm? And my father with... what exactly? Had Gary promised him money? A portion of his inheritance? My blood ran cold. Was he here for me? Dad's health deteriorated quickly after Mom died. At first it was a lack of appetite and a general feeling of hopelessness. By the end of the first month, though, his body had stopped taking nutrition at all. Anything he ate would come back up, and he'd stop sleeping thanks to the vivid night terrors that woke him up every time he dozed off. He'd become a human skeleton, an old man before his time, and I had to take a break from college so I could come home and take care of him. It seemed I also had to take care of my mother's problem, that being Gary in the complaint department. He would call or just come by to do laundry and wanted to complain about his job, his life, and whatever else there was to bitch about. If I tried to turn the conversation away from this, or refused to give him money, which I did often, he would rail at me for having it so easy. You can come home anytime. Mom and Dad bought you a car, paid for your college, and never pressured you to get a job, and never kicked you out of the house either. On and on and on and on. Gary had constructed a flawless narrative that painted himself as the hero, the victim, and everyone else just out to get him. He also asked about Dad to be sure he was still alive, as though the screaming or vomiting from the back of the house wasn't a big enough indication. I thought I caught him smiling a few times when I told him about how Dad was doing pretty poorly, and it seemed like a twin to the one now worn by this ghoul in the black suit. As his condition got worse, so did the night terrors. He didn't speak after Mom died, not a single word while awake, but he screamed her name every night. He would sit up in bed and swipe the air with his hands balled into fists as though fighting something off. He called her name again and again as he thrashed and moaned and finally crashed out of bed and woke himself up. He broke bones in those falls, but his broken limbs were never allowed to fully heal as he thrashed and fought every night that he lived. The doctors gave him 3 months after he stopped taking nourishment, but Dad fought on for 6 until he finally succumbed to a heart attack. When I found him on the floor of his bedroom, my sobs were tempered with relief. He wouldn't have to fight anymore, it seemed. Gary didn't come to his funeral either. I didn't see him until the reading of the will. I sat beside him in the lawyer's office, feeling my hands aching to claw his face. How dare he show up to get his prizes and slink back to his hole? How dare he show his face here after not even bothering to come to our father's funeral? I could barely process what the lawyer was saying over my own seething rage. My parents weren't wealthy, but they had left things for us in their will. They left me the house, Mom's car, the stocks and bonds that Dad had in a lockbox, and most of their money. Gary was left with a savings account Mom had set up, Dad's truck, some keepsakes, and Granddad's hunting lease. All in all, it was very generous of them, given their relationship with Gary and how antagonistic it had been. Still, you'd have thought they had left him the contents of their toilet. Gary raged. He was the oldest. He should have been given more. This was just like them to spurn him even in death. Before he could go on, though, I cut him off with a loud slap across his face. He was too surprised to speak, so I spoke for him. You want more, Gary? Well, where were you when I was planning Mom's funeral? Where were you when I was changing Dad's bed sheets and feeding him soup? Where were you when I was trying to get him in bed every night so he wouldn't hurt himself during his night terrors? I've taken care of our father for the last 6 months. I've taken care of the household duties, planned 2 funerals, and through it all, you weren't there. Worse, when you were there, you did nothing. You want more, Gary? Go fuck yourself. That seemed to galvanize him. His face went from surprise to furious in the span of a heartbeat. He strode from the lawyer's office without a word. He slammed the door behind himself, and I wouldn't see him again for 2 weeks. Not until I had to identify his remains. Did you kill Gary too? The man steepled his fingers and stared at me. No. Your brother's death was unforeseen. No one expected him to die so suddenly, especially at his age, before our debt with him was paid. I blinked. Your debt to him? Exactly. Your brother had approached us about another settling of affairs before he passed away. I already felt like I knew whose affairs my brother meant to settle. He wants to settle my affairs, doesn't he? The man actually looked a little sorrowful. I'm afraid so, ma'am. Normally we would offer you a chance to counter the offer. We certainly gave your mother the option, though I don't think she understood what was being discussed. Since payment on your affairs has already been received, though, I'm afraid it cannot be undone. I just stared at him. I know people who would beg. I know people who would threaten. I know people who would try anything to stop their fate from being sealed, but honestly, after learning that my brother had been responsible for our parents' deaths, I felt nothing but a deep sense of calm. When you know that there's nothing you can do to escape your fate, it's best to just accept it and get on with it. How will it happen? That's actually why I'm here today. Your brother and I never worked out the details of your settling. Your brother requested several extensions to find a unique and painful way to serve you your comeuppance. But, sadly, he died before he could decide on an appropriate means for your death. Our contract cannot be fulfilled until a method of your death has been agreed upon, and that is what brings me to your home today. And so, that's how I came to choose the time and manner of my own death. It seems weird at the age of 22 to plan your own demise, but I'll be the first to say that it's actually quite comforting. I'm sure my vindictive older brother would have concocted some grisly and painful ends for me. It delights me to know that I've avoided his hateful schemes. I hope it gives him no comfort, wherever he is, to know that all his hateful plans have been thwarted by nothing more than common bureaucracy and the providence of a well-timed semi. I told the man in his undertaker's suit that I wanted to die peacefully in my bed at the age of 106. He smiled wickedly as he read it and bowed low as he took his leave. I write this now, hoping that my brother will read this in whatever hell he's rotting in for all eternity. His debt was one I never minded settling. Good evening, my little creeperonies. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's reading. Time once again to thank our patrons. Thank you to Leslie Lou Riddle for being our spooky skeleton contributor. Thanks, Leslie. We couldn't do it without you. If you too would like your name read at the end of every episode, come on down to Patreon and become a member. We have 3 tiers, but the one you want is our spooky skeleton tier because it gets your name read out at the end of every video. Unless you happen to be a fellow reader of the spooky, then you may benefit from our Ghostwriter tier, which means you can read any of my stories in my catalog for only $10 a month. And as always, thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful evening.